Welcome to the Lifetime at Work podcast, episode number 10, the podcast about careers, life, and the businesses we work in. We spend so much of our lives at work, how do we make the time count? Well, this podcast is all about talking work, but in a different way, where we aren't afraid to share the bad along with the good and what work life is really like. My name is Greg Martin, and I've been working over 10 years in the corporate world, and I started my own business not too long ago, and now I'm the co-owner and CEO of a food business called Farmer. And every week I talk to guests from the business world about the happiness, challenges, and meaning they get from their jobs. The goal is to help you build more meaning, more purpose, and more fulfillment into your work. And this is a super special episode because we are talking about mental health, and I've been meaning to do this from the beginning. And so it's something we just rarely talk about, but we really should. So let's get going. If you're a fan of the podcast, please rate me. What that means is you can go to Apple Podcasts, just go to the Apple Podcast website, look for my podcast, or go to lifetimeatwork.com. You can click on a link there that says Apple Podcast and just leave me a rating. You can also do the same sort of thing on Google, and that would be awesome. I also wanted to let you know about our sponsor this week, which is Farmer Prepared Meals, as it is every week. It is the prepared meals company that I own and run, and we have been doing a lot of stuff. We have these cool Christmas boxes as well if you're looking for a gift, and lots of new meals to kind of get through. We're doing delivery throughout the Greater Toronto area every week. So if you go to farmr.ca, you can find us there and see what we're cooking up this week. They're all really easy, convenient meals. They take like 5 minutes on the stove to heat up, or you throw them in the oven for half an hour, and you've got a full, complete meal for the family. It's just super easy and great, and we make everything from scratch. We're sourcing locally. We're doing all the right things. So if you check us out, farmr.ca, and there, if you check out and you want to try us and get a bit of a discount, I can offer you that. You just have to use the discount code I know Greg, all one word, and that'll get you a certain percentage off. It changes depending on when you do it, but it'll always be there for this audience. So just use that promo code I know Greg at checkout. So this week's podcast is a special one. As I mentioned on the outset, it is about mental health. And I was looking for someone to talk about mental health with, and I found Mike, who I don't know. I've never met him before, but I reached out to him because he's doing a lot of cool things, I think. He has a company called Starts With Me, and he focuses on mental health for K-12 and also companies. So he goes into companies and he sets up programs to really bring them, I think, up to speed and up to how and where we should be thinking about when it comes to mental health, because we don't. There's this faux pas about talking about it in the workplace where we just don't say how we're feeling, and it's not the burden of the company to think about these things. But as we are working more and more, I think it does become a challenge, and I do think that people can really struggle with it and feel incredibly fearful for mentioning it to their boss or someone within the company that they're struggling with something, or that they are not feeling fulfilled or getting what they want out of their work, even though they're in a field that they're trained in, that they want to be in that work, so there's just a ton of challenges, I think, and we're going to talk about a lot of things relating to that. We start out the conversation more talking about what it is and what we're kind of talking about, but then we go into my background. I tell a story about how when I kind of freaked out at work and had what I would call kind of a breakdown of sorts, and then we go into Mike's background. He has suffered with addiction for most of his life, and because of that, he was inspired to help other people in doing it. He also had a long poker career. I don't know if it was long, but it was a fairly successful one. He did it for a while, mostly online, but he was just in the poker scene. So I've got some extra content too for that if you stay to the end to hear about kind of his poker career as well. But there's lots of interesting things, and I think it just use this episode to begin a conversation about mental health and how we should be feeling in the workplace and what that is all about, because it's just super important, and it's something that we just need to be more vulnerable with and open to talking to people. And as you'll see, Mike mentioned in the podcast, he says you just need one person that you can confide in and be vulnerable with and tell them what you're really feeling with, even if it's not your boss, someone that you can just open up to and have a conversation with. And that helps just so much and can be a great starting point for anyone. So So enjoy this episode with Michael Stroh talking about mental health in the workplace. Mike, welcome to the Lifetime at Work podcast. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It's awesome to be here.
So we wanted to get into a lot of things relating to mental health and your background and what you do. And there's a ton of stuff, but I thought that today, I first wanted to say the idea here is probably to focus mostly on the implications of mental health in the workplace and what that means. And I think it's particularly apparent with COVID-19 going on because the workplace now can mean at home, and I think it's still a thing, and it's a new thing for people, and trying to adapt to it can be challenging, and you could very easily find yourself struggling with something, feeling like you're either alone or at home, or that you need to suck it up, or that's what your boss or your colleagues are going to say. And so I just wanted to maybe start with almost defining what mental health and what we're sort of talking about when we mention this, and specifically kind of in the work.
Yeah, sure. It's a great question because these words are thrown around, all the time. And so, generally speaking, mental health is really just a state of how we feel about ourselves on a day-to-day basis, and perhaps how that connects to, the things we do in our lives. So that might be work or family, or more generally speaking, our communities or our societies at large, and that we feel a sense of agency to influence, the way our life goes. And then it wasn't specific to the question, I guess, but then that's where sort of the boundary or the blurred lines between mental illness and mental health start to happen. And so that, I think, is where that's a little bit misunderstood, perhaps, or what that looks like in people's lives.
Yeah, I guess what you're trying to say is that there is kind of what we talk about mental health, which is just feeling good and happy and all those sorts of things. And when that doesn't happen, it could be because there's circumstances that happened, or because you're suffering from something which is a little more clinical that you actually need, that needs to be diagnosed, et cetera. Is that kind of where you're coming from with this?
Yeah. And um, I would also say I think there's a bit of a misalignment of our perhaps perceptions of what is and isn't possible. I think we're not supposed to be happy all the time. And so
Right.
that's another thing, right? I think people might think, oh, my mental health is bad because I'm not happy. That's not necessarily the case. People have all kinds of different emotions, and so sometimes we're happy. I think the wisest way that it's put is if we set up our lives in a way that's conducive to happiness, then we'll have more experiences of happiness. It's
Right.
sort of, I know I'm kind of talking around the edges, but I think that's an important point, because a lot of people start to be critical of themselves when they're not happy, when they think they should be. And so
Right.
I think it's an important reminder, just that, life isn't about being happy per se.
Yeah, yeah, right, exactly. Well, I sort of think of it, especially when bad things happen, that yeah, it's about all these emotions and going through all these emotions, and you can't have the good if you don't have the bad, in many ways, where or
Right,
it makes the
right.
good times so much better when you've worked hard for something. If someone just gives you all the money in the
Yeah,
world and all
yeah,
of
right.
the here's all the vacation time you'd ever need and all these things that you think you want, those
Yeah.
people aren't happy, and you can definitely, that's not it. It's not the end. I think we are more complicated creatures than that. um
We are. That's a good way to put it, no doubt.
um but there's this stigma, I feel like, in the workplace that we
Hmm?
shouldn't, that it's just not a place for it. It's not a place to kind of talk about your feelings and especially when you get into certain jobs, it's like, oh, come on, man, we don't have time for this. Like, you get your job done. Like, I feel like there's probably this, I don't know, that there's probably an old school mentality. But
Uh-huh.
when jobs become so much of our lives and such a big part of it, I think they can get kind of dangerous. And right, I think it's kind of where I'm going with it. Why do you think there is this stigma in the workplace that we shouldn't be talking about how we're feeling?
Yeah. Yeah. It's such a fascinating kind of situation. So try to break it down as sort of concisely as I can. On one side, you have, some workplaces and some jobs are simply not the place to be talking about those things while you're on the job necessarily. So
Yeah.
for example, if I'm a firefighter and I'm going into a fire, that's not the time where I'm going to be worried about my emotions and need to talk about it. And so afterwards, perhaps in the workplace, when you're in between um, kind of action, so to speak, that might be a time to talk about it.
Yeah.
And also some work environments aren't conducive to open, honest discussions. And so that might have to do with management, or that might have to do with coworkers. There's so many kind of factors involved there. And I think ideally, yes, we want to be able to talk about these things and not experience shame or fear about opening up about something you're struggling with. Yet at the same time, maybe the workplace isn't that environment. And I don't think that question's being posed enough. And I'm
Yeah.
not saying I don't necessarily know the answer, yet it's important to consider the different angles. So that would be one side. And then on the other side of, if you are in a workplace that does encourage these things, and there's a lot of evidence that suggests, when you have a leadership that is a role model for this type of behavior, then that's wonderful, right? And then that encourages other people to be vulnerable and to share as well. Um, and I don't know this as thoroughly, but from the things I read and people I listen to, there's also some sense of perhaps sort of being vulnerable and open with your emotions wasn't a safe thing to do. And so now
Right.
that
Yeah.
we live in an environment, or we live in a civilization where that's becoming more safe, I think we're moving in the right direction. I think in contemporary discourse
Yeah.
around
Yeah.
social issues, we have a serious lack of perspective, and balancing that need to have perspective and perhaps a little bit of gratitude is really important.
Yeah, I do enjoy when we bring it back to evolution and explain. I think it's helpful in explaining, here's why you're feeling this, or here's why it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's helpful to understand it. But
Mm-hmm.
what are some companies doing? Because I think what you're saying too as well is that there are some companies who are on top of this and they make it part of their just their culture and their operations and just everything to consider the feelings and emotions and some other employees, and
Yeah.
others it's just not part of it, and it's not necessarily their fault, it's just not the way that it's done. But what is kind of the
Yeah.
realm of, I mean, say a company were to really worry about this and really think, okay, I need my employees to be healthy because they work better and we want people to come here who are healthy,
Right.
and it's all that sort of thing. What does that
Yeah.
mean? Like, how do they tackle mental health? Is it sort of having a a professional on staff or on call or part like, or is it a training thing, or how do companies who are, call it, at the leading edge of this address it?
Yeah. To be honest, I think the market, if you will, is still trying to figure that out. I think it's funny, I'm in the midst of planning for an event in the spring, and part of our research is to find companies that are doing a really good job of this. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, I think that we're still a lot in the process of knowing it's a good idea, thinking people should do it, or organizations should do it, and I'm sure there's many out there doing it already without even knowing. But I would say, if you have a process, in some sense, it would usually starts with leadership, although it doesn't have to, where they, uh, what's the word? Show, don't tell is something I often say. So
Yeah.
rather than, I
Be
know I'm kind
about
of
it. Be
talking
about it, I guess. If they're
as
about it,
opposed to
right?
talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah.
for example, I'll say one more thing and then I'll stop talking, trying to explain this, because situation to kind of pick the pieces apart. But in the National Standard for Psychological Health and Safety in the Workplace, which is sort of Canada's template document for how you would incorporate a mental health strategy. One of the first things that they say is leadership should write up a statement that they care about mental health and da 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 da, and send it out to the whole company.
Right.
And from my perspective, that's completely backwards, because people are so used to lip service as opposed to action. So we have a document that's called How to Create Mentally Healthy Teams That Are Connected, Effective, and Purpose Driven. And we kind of start from the other way around. So we say, act it out first. And then people are much more willing to follow along. So that's where leadership, just, you kind of said it too, just acts it out or bees about it as opposed to talks about it, and then
Yeah.
things follow from there.
So maybe this is a good opportunity to just chat, to talk about the background and what you do, and kind of your company, and sort of what you're trying to achieve, and with the probably, I mean, just generally, and kind of a little bit your background. We'll get more into sort of the education and where you came from, but maybe
Sure.
just talk about sort of what you are doing now.
Well, it's been an amazing, busy time, and I have a sense that I've reached a base camp in my climbing up the mountain. But I just finished a master's in counseling psychology, so I'm about 36 hours away from being accepted into the College of Registered Psychotherapists, so I can call myself that. Probably by the time this gets posted, I'll be
Nice.
allowed to say that.
Okay.
So I'm going to say that. So I am a psychotherapist on that side. But in terms of workplace mental health, primarily we've been doing 1 hour lunch and learns and 3 hour training sessions. And back to what I said earlier, that's sort of where the market is. Or organizations know this is important. They're still super busy with their day-to-day operations. So finding ways to bring this into the workplace is hard. So most companies, they want to know what workplace mental health means, how it impacts them kind of on a daily basis, and then that's enough. Other companies are starting to do leadership training. So we've done a lot of that with one company in particular for a couple of years, where we spend 2 to 3 hours, depending on the location, with their supervisors. And we just go through a little more thorough in depth of how do you be an example of someone who's honest and open, and sort of at the same time working hard. I think that's another misconception, back to the stigma piece, is people think by being open and honest, they'll be looked at kind of as if they're lazy or weak or soft. And so I think it is important to, if you are going to do that, you also want to show that you are dedicated to your work, and willing to do whatever you take to be an employee who contributes. So those are the
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
things that
yeah.
we talk about in those sessions. And we also have a 6 month to 1 year full program that's modeled after the National Standard for Psych Safety in the Workplace. And we call it Connected and Effective Teams. And so that's what we are in the process of, with one client in particular, trying to figure out how we may incorporate that into a year-long training program. And then we also have an event in May called the State of Mind Festival, and that's a mix of our work with schools, K-12 education, and then also workplace mental health.
Gotcha. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So this is all through Starts With Me.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, so this is the kind of the company
Yeah.
that you do it, and it's really focused on workplace mental health in K to 12. But I think, as you've told me, it's this evolving thing where there isn't necessarily a, okay, this model works, we've figured it out, here's how we go, and one by one change your entire culture, and right, and make you a
Yeah,
mentally health focused company. Like, it's not how it works. It's sort of a, I think, a still learning process, because a lot of this is new for the industry, for your industry, and also for companies.
definitely. Actually, I'm glad, sorry, thanks for kind of opening that up a little bit. So our model, or our process, if we were to work with a company for a year, it is sort of modeled after the national standard, yet we think a little more innovative and practical.
Yeah.
And I'll sort of go through the 5 things quickly, because as you said, it's not a one size fits all. So our first step is clarity, and that's where it's what is mental health in the workplace and how does it impact your organization. So you look at a list of KPIs for mental health things, which Deloitte did a great job at presenting this information. About a year ago, they published a little, I guess, report. It was really good. And so you want to know how many people are calling in sick, how much, money are you spending on employee benefits, how much are people spending on medication, how much money are you spending on training, all those kind of things. So each organization would map that out, get a list of how much they're paying. And then step two would be courage. That's where, here's the situation. Do we have the willingness perhaps, or the commitment to actually implement this? Because again, it's one thing to say it's important and da 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 da. It's a whole nother thing to do it. So we would go through a sort of a courage building process where people get connected and feel comfortable. And then step three is creativity. So that's where it's sort of using imagination, creativity, and ingenuity to create a map or to create a vision of how that organization wants to implement a plan. And then step four is constancy, which is a balance of patience and persistence. And so as a company is going through this transformation, difficulties are going to arise and people are going to get upset and those kind of things. And can we maintain balance and perseverance as that's happening? And then you start tracking the KPIs. Are they changing? Like, are more people asking for help, or are more people, having difficult conversations that lead to positive outcomes? And then the last step, compassion, is, okay, now we've gone through this transformation. How do we give back? Because that's another big part of organizational well-being, you could say, is having a purpose outside of the day-to-day work. And so that's, I think, perhaps a little bit of a difference between us and the national standard. Is now we're here. Awesome. This is great. How do we share this with other companies, or how do we give back to our communities, or what does it mean for us to be engaged in, we would say, creating a better world, right? Because that's kind of what we all want, I think.
What do you think? I'm curious about people and in companies and what because I imagine there are certain individuals where this is more important than others. It's just whatever. I'm not trying to be too crazy with that bold or with that statement. So what do you think creates a situation where you may struggle with mental health or anxiety or depression, like in the workplace? Because sometimes you don't even know. Sometimes you don't. I imagine there's people who might be listening to this and say like, hey, yeah, I mean, I'm curious about mental health, etc. But they may also, even in themselves, may not be able to sort of identify a problem, or that there's an issue, or that is something that they should be talking about. And then, because I think also too, if you want to then recognize it in someone else and help them potentially, that's important too. So what are we kind of looking for, and what maybe creates a situation where someone needs that help or is actually struggling with something?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the technical term, or if we were doing training, we would say how to identify warning signs of deteriorating mental health.
Yeah.
And so, I think so there's, you also nailed it in the terms of how does it work individually, and then how might you recognize it in someone else. This also goes back to the boundary between mental health and mental illness or mental health disorder. Again, so stress, emotions, we're human beings. We experience this wide variety of experience. And clinically speaking, where stress, anxiety, sadness, anger, all these kind of emotions, if they become dominant in your daily life and they get in the way of you performing your work duties and maybe your home responsibilities, then that would be a sign of perhaps a mental health disorder developing. And that's when you should sort of ask for help. And there's 4 main domains. So it would be your thoughts, your feelings, your body sensations, and your behaviors. So if I'm constantly thinking that I'm a failure, or that, nobody at my work likes me. And sometimes these things are true. Okay. So it's important to notice that. But
Yeah.
if you start to notice these patterns happening in yourself, you're really critical all the time. You have a short fuse. You have one type of emotion that's dominating your experience. You can't concentrate on your work. You're coming home and you're angry with your family members. That's normal from time to time. But if that becomes consistent over a long period of time, then that's probably a warning sign that your mental health is deteriorating, and it might be the onset of a mental health disorder, something like that. And so if you can notice them in yourself, then chances are you can notice them in other people. And that's sort of the whole thing. The name of our business starts with me. It's sort of, you have to be able to internalize these things, because nobody, there's nothing more annoying than someone walking around pointing out everyone else's problems, yet they're incapable of looking at their own.
Yeah, I hear you. So like I
Yeah.
wanted to tell a kind of a quick story about myself to hopefully sort of relate to
Please.
people and see if what you think anyways. But when I graduated from university, and obviously I really wanted a job. That was what I really wanted. And so I got one, and it was in investment banking, and didn't really know what it was, but I was excited to do it. But the one thing that I did know was that it was going to be a lot of hours. It was going to just be, and not just the reputation. It's like, hey, the pay is good, but the hours are long. And I was like, all right, fine, I can do that. And so mentally, I had to do a bunch of things to get myself in the right spot to do it. But I basically told myself, okay, I'm going to commit to this job for X number of years and just do it, and put the other things in the back burner, like my friendships and my family. And not that I would ignore these people, but that they would sort of come second. And I would, it was the job and a profession that I had to do to be sort of all in. And I figured it out in a lot of ways, where I would, when I had a free second, I would call someone and try to meet up with friends. And I wouldn't say I'd be there on time, but I would come late, etc. And I did pretty well. But then I think it was about 3 years in, so this was in 2010, I had a bit of a breakdown. And I remember, I think it was just I had a bad week, really kind of a bad week, where I was just feeling like underappreciated. I think I was just not in love with it. I didn't really want to be at work, and I just had these doubts. And then I remember having weekend plans, and there was this Friday where all of a sudden there was this new project. It was going to be a full weekend of stuff that I just knew, because I had seen this before. I'm like, this is a full weekend. And I snapped in the sense that I couldn't do it anymore. And so I remember calling my boss at the time and just quitting over the phone. He was like at the cottage or on his way to the cottage. And I just sort of called him and said, hey, Jim, I'm quitting, by the way. Like, I can't do this anymore. I don't want to do it. And it was this bottling up of emotions and things that I just couldn't. Yeah. I was just so frustrated with everything. And I felt a little bit trapped too. And that I couldn't quit, that I had committed to this, and I was sort of failing, but at the same time, I just couldn't handle it. It got bottled up. But I had never it was not something that I could ever mention to anyone before, or felt like I could. I had this was the one thing in my life that I had. It was this job. And I couldn't say that this was a failure or that I didn't want to do it or anything, right? Because it was just that was too big of a reality to accept, I think. And so, but eventually I did, and I said, okay, I just have to quit. And so, to his credit, he did a great job. He said, I can tell this is a rash decision that you're making. He didn't say this, but through what he said, he kind of said, hey, I can tell you're doing, if you want to quit, totally okay. Like, you do not have to work here. It's your choice, but like, I can clearly tell that you need, time off. So like, take 2 weeks, think about it. If you still want to quit after 2 weeks, like, don't answer emails, don't do anything after 2 weeks. If you still want to quit, you totally can, but I'm sort of giving you this. And so I said, all right, well, I can't argue with that. Thank you. And I went, and after those 2 weeks, I think, I had a few discussions with them and ultimately changed a little bit about what I was doing in my job. But, after that, I was super happy, and I really liked, it didn't even take that long to get it, but I sort of, I don't know if it snapped or had just such an anxiety, whatever. So I don't know if you have more of a clinical diagnosis or or any insight kind of on what happened to me, but I'm just trying to see if, where you think that fits and what companies can do, or if that is a common thing that may happen to people. And
yeah, I'm just curious. So did you end up quitting, or did you come back for a little while?
No, I ended up coming back. Yeah, I came back, and I
cool.
I was into it. I struggle to remember exactly why. I was at a breaking point where it just was too much, and maybe I did need the vacation and was afraid to
Yeah.
take it myself, and it
No,
was
I
just so
mean,
much, I don't
yeah,
know. Yeah, I just yeah.
yeah. And how old were you at the time?
This was 2010, so yeah, like 25.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, it's a great example of, I mean, at that age, I think it's hard to expect much else from someone, you know. I think you were eager, you were young, you had energy, so you just went full steam ahead. I would say an example would be, as you kind of mentioned, that you didn't want to acknowledge it, or maybe you weren't ready to, or there was some part of you, perhaps we could call it your conscience, that was sort of every now and then would say, hey, this isn't good, you're working too much, or
Yeah.
something's wrong here. Was that sort of happening? It's sort of,
Yeah, like if I
and you would
had
push
if I had
away,
listed my
or
priorities in life or something like that, or what I wanted, it wasn't necessarily this, but at the same time, I was sort of in some way I was achieving one of many things. I would say, of all the things was trying, my goals, right? This was one thing. It was a good job that paid well, I guess, is right. But it was sort of like
yeah,
I was ignoring so many other things.
right. So that's what I mean. So
Yeah.
even in terms of being at work on a daily basis, sitting at your desk, like another job comes in, you're just kind of go through this, oh my God,
Right.
not more, that kind
Yeah.
of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh
So
yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
there's something there that's signaling to us that something needs to change.
Right.
And so if we can listen to that more often, as opposed to stuffing it down, then maybe we don't get to those breaking points as often.
Yeah.
And you were pretty young, so I think a lot of people, aren't, they wait till they're 40 or something before they kind of finally, acknowledge that they're just totally burnt out and overworked.
Right.
But another example that's great from the story is when you said something, um, you were able to reassess or reorganize your work situation so that it wasn't so overbearing. Is that's
Yeah,
what
yeah,
I got from what you said.
I
So
think
yeah,
so. I needed kind of a reset, and part of it too was just being acknowledged, or the appreciation, or the right, working with the right people. I actually put a lot of stake
yeah,
in myself in the people you're around, and because there's certain environments that you can be, and in my work experience, there could be great people, and that really, even if the job is awful, you can have some great people that you work with that you really enjoy seeing every day, and that makes
yeah,
everything.
yeah,
And the opposite
yeah.
can also be true and make it terrible, right? And not to say that the people I was
Yeah.
working with are terrible. It was just not in the right place at the right time, and just these perfect things that made it yeah, just not what I needed at the time, or that week, or
Right,
that
right.
month.
I think one other thing I might say would be, as a leader or as a boss, manager, etc., if you notice, if I was your boss at the time, perhaps I could notice how hard you're working and how
Yeah.
much you're burning the candle at both ends, and just say, hey, buddy, you are working super duper hard. Maybe it's time for a break. I think that's in the research on workplace, I guess, performance. Acknowledgement and recognition is a huge contribution to employee satisfaction.
Yeah.
So that's another thing where leadership can sort of step up a little bit and practice that a bit more.
Yeah, and just almost forcing vacation, saying, "Hey,
Yeah,
not
yeah,
being the boss who
yeah,
says, "Oh, he hasn't taken vacation in 3 years. This is amazing. He's such a hard worker," and instead
yeah.
saying, "No, no, no, no. Like,
Right.
let's plan something here. Where do you want to go? Let's go somewhere. Or what do you want to do here? Take some time. Go do it, please, please." Which
Yes, exactly.
it
Yeah,
sounds
even on a
crazy, but
daily
isn't.
basis. Yeah.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Head home.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Even, it's like, man, you look stressed out today. Do you have anything that's super urgent to do right now? No. Okay. Why don't you go home? Or why
yeah,
don't you go for a walk or take an early lunch, or just little things like that? I think what prevents people from doing that is this sort of catastrophizing of, oh no, if I tell them to go take a break, then they're just going to be lazy forever and they're never going to come back. And, that whole totally backwards way of thinking. But
Yeah.
when we're more compassionate and helpful to people, they tend to respond in positive ways.
Yeah. So I'll give you the chance now to tell your sort of your background and why did you choose this
Sure.
path and the counseling road as
Yeah.
your career and how you wanted to help and impact the world.
Sure. Thanks. Yeah, I think it sounds cliche and cheesy, but I'm going to say it anyways. I would just say that it chose me. And
Okay.
so, I mean, I had a long history of mental illness and addiction, from about 12 to 30. And I was high 24 hours a day, literally for 17 years, primarily cannabis, and modern day sort of super cannabis, not kind of the hippie stuff that the people smoked in the 60s and 70s.
Right.
Um, and so it really, had quite a profound impact on my brain development and emotional development. And I also have a brother who lives with schizophrenia. So that's sort of my past. It was pretty, and I was in trouble with the police as a teenager quite a lot. And so a lot of difficult past, you could say. And then I got married, and that's sort of when reality came crashing down. And so I asked for help. I got help, which was a really beautiful process. And that's sort of one thing it's always important to note. And it is a cliche because it's said too much, but you can't do it alone. And asking for help is actually a sign of courage, not weakness. And so I did that. As a last, I tried everything else. That's another thing. People, for whatever reason, have to be at, they have to be willing to stop digging their own hole at the point where they can then ask for help. So I did that, a couple of years into my recovery. I got a psychiatrist, I got a psychotherapist, I got a mindfulness teacher, all through OHIP, and I had to wait a long time for this, but I got that. I was going to 12-step meetings. I had a sponsor. I mean, nothing was more important than healing myself.
Yeah.
I was told if I put anything in front of my recovery, I'm going to lose it. So I took that really seriously. And fast forward a couple of years, then I got invited to participate in a program at CAMH, Center for Addiction and Mental Health, called Beyond the Cuckoo's Nest, which is probably the longest standing youth mental health education program in Canada for sure, maybe the world. It's a great program. And so I started working with the high schools a lot. And then a couple years later, after I retired from my poker career, which I didn't really mention, but I was a pretty successful online poker player. It's probably one of the highest grossing online tournament poker players in Canada, certainly, but maybe in the world. And I said, wait a second, this mental health education stuff could actually be fun and cool and interesting. So I'm going to naively try to start a business.
Yeah.
And that's when we started planning the festival. And then a couple years later, and so why I say it chose me, it was like I never did any outreach really. It was never like I'm going to go and try and sell my services here. It was just I kept getting, the more talks I did, the more people started contacting me. And then it sort of spiraled into workplaces started contacting me. I'll never forget the first day. I have a website friend who does SEO stuff. He's amazing. Logical Mix, I got to plug him. Joel. Anyway, he's like, you got to put your phone number on your website. What's wrong with you? And so
Yeah.
I put my phone number on the website, and like 2 days later, I get this phone call. Hello, is this Starts With Me? I was like half asleep. And I was like, yes, it is. And that was from, I don't want to name the name to call myself out, but it was from a pretty big organization in Toronto. And that's when that started. And so then the more I got more into workplaces, more into et cetera. And then, a conversation with my wife was like, okay, if this doesn't work out, what the hell are you going to do? And so that's when I decided to go back to school and get the master's so I could become a psychotherapist.
Right.
And so, fast forward, we've worked with Amazon, we've worked with Hyundai, Hootsuite, we did an amazing training program for supervisors at the city of Toronto. And it just sort of one day at a time, one foot in front of the other. And here I am talking to you about this stuff. It's pretty awesome. So
Yeah,
I
no,
hope that paints the picture to some respects. Yeah.
yes, I have a million questions based on that. It's challenging to pick because
Okay.
there's so many little things. I want to know everything about the poker thing and also, but
Sure.
also like addiction. Anyways, I don't know that I'm not going to ask you everything, but, but,
Yeah.
so I guess though, probably the biggest one is why this then in helping people. I mean, was there something that you realized, I guess, in yourself that then made you want to help others in trying to figure it out, and knowing also, I mean, so you were in this place for what you said, 17 years.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
like what brings you out of it, I guess, or and like, can you, is it people like what you're doing now that can change that? And I'm just curious as sort of that. I don't know, I'm not asking the
Yeah.
question
Yeah.
great, but
No, no, that
yeah.
was beautiful. That honestly, no, I think you said what you said. I was getting tingles when you asked you said about, what was it sort of in you, or what motivated you to kind of get into this? You said something along those lines.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'd say my own recovery in some sense, here's the saying: you can't keep what you don't freely give away. And that's a sort of a spiritual idea, you could say, or whatever. Um, and so I took that to heart quite deeply. Um, and part of my own recovery practice is being of service to other human beings. And so, I mean, to be quite honest, my life was torturous. Like, being a drug addict is like not fun. It is like the worst. Gabor Mate, who's I'd say one of the world's leading addiction specialists, has this wonderful saying. Um, After all these years of working in this space, I've still yet to meet an addict who chose to be an addict. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
nobody wants that life. Nobody really wants to be there. And in some sense, it does become a choice, and people need to learn that. But on a surface level, like, nobody chooses that. So I also, my brother living with schizophrenia, like, there was a lot of just trauma, you could say, not, maybe not big T trauma, but um, so all that pain and suffering, the beautiful help I got from so many people, I kind of just, whatever was inside me said, you're going to share this with other people. That's going to help you, right? So that's another misconception. We actually help ourselves by helping other people.
Yeah.
And so that was sort of that was the motivating factor. And I sort of lose sight of it. Not, it's been about 9 years, just over 9 years that I've been sober. And so I forget sometimes that my primary focus is to take care of myself. And when I can do that, then everything else takes care of itself. So that was the motivation behind it all, was just my family went through so much shit. Um, and if I can help others not experience as much shit,
Yeah.
excuse my language, then beautiful.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um,
Yeah.
maybe one more question on addiction.
Yeah,
Is
please.
what
Yeah.
is it? Just I think some of it is a certain personality, that certain personalities are more predisposed. Is that kind of, as a
Yeah.
quick question, correct?
Fair
Okay.
to say.
And so
Yeah. Yeah.
for us as sort of parents and people, and trying to identify these things, or trying to help someone who is in that situation of being addicted
Yes.
to something, how do you broach that? Like, is it just a matter of
Mm.
not starting it? Like, I imagine you said, I think you were 16, 17 when you start. Like, how do you prevent your kid
Oh,
from
yeah.
getting into that, or even just educating someone, or then helping someone who's in the situation? I know this is a loaded question and entire professions on it, but maybe
Yeah.
a succinct answer of some sort you have. I don't know.
Yeah, I think I can. And I, just to go back, I started when I was 12. So I didn't even think I had pubic
Sorry.
hair when I
Yeah.
started.
Jeez.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, that's okay. But
Yeah.
it's a terror. I mean, so the first thing, just to give sort of a description of addiction. Addiction is basically any behavior that is a response. So somebody has an internal pain and internal trauma, then they engage in a behavior. So whether it's substance use, like putting things inside your body, or whether it's like sex or shopping or any behavior that is a short-term fix, basically. So we use the drugs to make the pain go away.
Yeah.
Then no matter what the negative consequences are of that behavior, we can't stop. Like, we want to stop, we know it's not good for us, but for whatever reason we can't actually stop. So that's sort of a succinct definition of addiction. And then in terms of looking out for it in other people, perhaps, or the causes, some of it is sort of I wouldn't say hereditary, but it's important to know your family history, because if you know the family history, then you know that it might be more likely for your offspring or your family members to exhibit these things.
Yeah.
And then in terms of, here's another funny statement is, if you tell an addict, and forgive the sort of blunt language, if you tell an addict what to do and they know what you're telling them is good for them, they will do the opposite just to spite you. And then they'll blame you for telling them to do the opposite, right? Like, so that's like, so then the next thing would be, okay, if you want to talk to someone who you know is having a hard time, using I statements is really important. So I notice, or to me, it looks like you are having a hard time with X. Is that true? And that opens up some space for them to take ownership of it or not. And so if they say, no, I'm fine, leave me alone, then you need to say, okay, and you need to leave them alone. This is more for adults. Obviously, if you have a young or teen kid where you still have more influence, then maybe you can kind of impose your will a bit more, although the outcomes are questionable on that approach. And so that's what I would say. Yeah, like using I statements. Don't tell people what to do or what to think or how to feel, and really respect their boundaries and their autonomy.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's hard because we want to help people. We want to, it's like the savior complex,
And that's the thing. You're just trying to figure out, okay, what can I do? How can I get to them? How can I, but you don't want to push them away, but I don't know. Yeah. It sounds like, and I've seen a bunch of movies on this actually too, which, it can also seem ridiculous. Just in the sense of, like, there's parents who are basically disowning their children because they're doing it. And they said, well, we've gone through this and we've just been so destructive. I don't know what else to do. And you're like, well, how can you do that as a parent? Like, you just have these, and it's just these dilemmas that you end up being faced with, which are crazy.
Torture. Torture.
Yeah.
Torture. I think I just want to add to that one point is just, in some ways as a parent, it doesn't make you a bad parent. I think that's another thing that's really hard to accept, is like, maybe you are a bad parent, but if you're doing everything you can, and it's still not working, doesn't make you a bad parent. And there's nothing wrong with like kicking your kid out of the house if you've done everything you possibly can. And so anyway, again, loaded topic, difficult. People have different opinions, but it's important to honor that other side of it.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you there.
Yeah, no. I wanted to kind of mildly switch gears anyways, and just go back to sort of the workplace thing a little bit more, and just talk about kind of COVID-19 and the impact that you think that could have on people in just being alone. And some of the things, so I've been asking everyone, because I'm super curious about it, how is working from home and the changing dynamic now in your work and your job, and do you regard your job, and there's lots of people out there who are learning an incredible amount about themselves, what they like to do, their work habits. Some people love it, some people they're like, oh my god, I need to get out. Like, there's just all these different things, but because it's been such a stark and forced situation, it's been big. But I also feel like there isn't necessarily a place where you can complain too much, because people who say have a job but now hate it because of the situation, they can't, in some situations you can't say you're just happy to have a job, because there's lots of people who don't. How do you think
Totally.
COVID-19 has sort of impacted the mental health? And I sort of have a loaded second question of, how can we sort of recognize it as, whether it be bosses or colleagues or friends or whatever, in people who are, now have maybe a tough situation that they may not be comfortable in talking about?
In terms of the impacts, I think you said it pretty well there. We're all adjusting to new ways of daily life. So inherently there's stress there. And there's another underlying stressor that's also hard to understand the long-term implications, but I'll try to describe it as best I can. So we, as a human, like as a biological organism, part of our internal process is to maintain, some people use the word homeostasis or balance, is the how we interpret the world around us, and then how we adjust our internal state to meet that interpretation. So now that everything is so uncertain, that relationship between the external world and the internal biological organism is been unsettled since last March, or since March. And so that is just a constant underlying anxiety that's we're all kind of dealing with. So that's going to influence all kinds of different parts of your life. So there's that piece. And then, I guess it does depend on the type of job you have. I think as a parent, we're both parents, having kids, thank gosh the schools are open right now. But, from March to June or even to September, it was intense. And the parents are, I think, there's a little lip service to it, but parents are under an incredible amount of stress right now, I think, or at least were while the kids were home. And so even for people with toddlers and stuff, it is just, it's difficult. And I don't think there's any cherry on top, it's sort of learning to deal with the pain and the shittiness of everything that's happening is, we can kind of manage as best we can. And then you also said, the people that do have jobs can, regardless of how shitty it is, can you find places of gratitude and sort of balance out the difficulties with some gratitude and appreciation for where you're at. And try not, I always say it's really important not to judge other people for how they're handling the pandemic.
Yeah,
Personally, I'm walking down the sidewalk and I see somebody who's not moving out of the way, and I instantly, that thing in my head is like, oh, this person's not being nice, da, 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 da. And so just noticing how you're judging people and judging yourself and all that kind of stuff, and just trying to, it's a cliche again, but one day at a time, one moment at a time. Like, I think that's the best we can do right now, to be honest.
Yeah. No, is there anything that we can do then, maybe potentially to recognize it in people through online? Is it just, I guess, having conversations?
Yeah.
And honestly, that's what part of why I want to do this podcast is that if this is a cliche, if just one person, but if someone can read and say, hey, I was listening to this podcast and they were talking about such and such, and it's just a way to start a conversation. Or I met this person or whatever. It can be good to sort of open the door, because I think, I've worked in the corporate environment for a long time, and it's hard to talk about things that are vulnerable and different, especially in a time when, other people are struggling too. And and they feel like, oh my God, my boss is so busy and they're doing this, and we're our business is down, and I can't even mention my problems, and yada, yada, yada. And it's just these tough situations, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So it could just be hard to bring up. So I'm hopeful anyways. Is there any other things you can kind of do to sort of identify it?
Again, I think it always goes back to the self. So if you can notice these things in yourself, that's a big win. And then the biggest key, this is, more so for young people, but absolutely for adults. If you just have one person in your life that you can be honest and vulnerable with, that is fantastic. So whether it's a friend, a spouse, a therapist, a parent, we need one person, at least one. So that's number one and most important, is you can't keep it inside. Keeping it inside just makes you more sick, so to speak. So having one person you can talk to, and then in terms of noticing it in other people, like obviously, yeah, now that it's all virtual, it's much harder to, we talked earlier about noticing the signs and symptoms of deteriorating mental health. How some, I've read a couple things along the lines of, if your team meetings are video on, and then you notice one person all of a sudden is always has their video off, that might be a sign that something's going on with that person. And you know that's where it goes back to the I statements. I have noticed that X, and I am worried about you, or I feel sad, or etc. Another thing would be, to me it looks like this, or if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here to talk to you. That's where it gets tricky, but those are some of the things in the virtual world. Another thing is sometimes just sending someone a note.
Yeah.
you know Send them a note on the side, like, hey, how's it going? I don't know, those little things. I think we forget how important and powerful just those little graces and those little social cues from day to day can be really helpful. um
Yeah.
and
Or
I
even an
and
appreciation, I
yeah, I
imagine,
think
or a message of appreciation saying, I
yes,
really liked how you did this, or you
yes,
did a great job on that. Because
yes.
I've never really met anyone who's does that too much. It's all, you can always kind of do it more,
Yeah.
right? Um,
Yeah, totally.
yeah.
So I think that those are some things. I think also maintaining, like, again, the gratitude's really important. Carving out moments in your day where you can just lie down and give yourself a break. A lot of the work we've been doing during COVID is focused around self-compassion, which I think is an incredible tool for well-being. Um, and I think it's also a little misunderstood, but finding some self-compassion, understanding what that actually means, and those kind of things. And
Yeah,
as you
yeah, yeah.
said, we could talk about this stuff
Oh
for
yeah,
hours and
yeah.
and etc. But yeah. Yeah.
Well, so one thing I ask, kind of everyone in some fashion or another, is what makes you happy and fulfilled about what you do in your job. You've answered a little bit,
Yeah.
but I just wanted to sort of specifically call that out and ask if there was something.
Yeah. I think the biggest gift of what I get to do is creating an environment where people feel comfortable to be vulnerable. So, when I'm in a workshop or working with a team, or even in a school, and somebody says something that for sure they probably would have never said had you not been there, and sort of made that conversation possible, that's what fills me with joy and gratitude and positive emotion. It's just such a beautiful thing, because I think that's the solution to healing our world, is sort of people finding within them the courage, or the willingness to open up and speak from that sincere place. And
Yeah.
and when people do that, I melt. I literally melt in the middle of the session. That I soak it up, and I love that, because we're just we're just all walking around with a little bit of a facade. And sometimes that's,
Yeah.
we need that facade sometimes, or we need that sort of shield. But the more we can let it go when it's not serving us, I think the better.
Yeah. Um,
Yeah,
what can people? I'm gonna ask you another question after, but what do
please. Yeah.
people do to kind of learn more about? I guess, like, I will definitely link to you and your website
Sure.
on through mine and the episode. Do
Uh-huh.
you also have, and maybe it's just easiest to send them to me and I'll post them, but do you have any sort of resource? I don't want to overwhelm people, but like, hey, you should really watch this video or this resource or something like that to take the. I always feel this is steps. You can take the next step if you're really engaged in the conversation
Yeah.
and the cause and that.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I think, well, one thing for sure is on our website under resources, we have a little self-care and self-compassion workbook. It's a PDF. It's about 12 pages, something like that. And it goes through, I would say I'm quite proud of it. I think it's really concise, and it just gets to the point. Here's why you need to take care of yourself. Here's a list of things that you can answer their questions really, um, where it helps people develop these skills. So I would encourage that. Um, in terms of videos, I would say I do have a YouTube channel with some helpful things there. There's a lot on cannabis addiction if that is something you're curious about for people. So yeah, I would just go to the resource section on the website and
Great.
there's some
Okay.
stuff there.
Awesome. I'll
Yeah,
link to that. Yeah, yeah, for sure. Easy way to do it. Um, yeah, I
totally.
appreciate your time and coming on and sharing it with my audience.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And I love these conversations, and keep up the great work. It's pretty cool what you're doing.
Absolutely. So if you want a little extra bonus content, I am going to post on YouTube. I've got a new YouTube channel kind of just beginning and starting up. And I will link to it in the show notes, and I will link to it on my social media and that sort of stuff, where you can see me ask Mike about his poker career. I'm just interested in that quite a bit, so I thought I would ask him, but the episode was running too long, so it's only about 7 minutes or something like that. But if you want to check that out and hear about what it was like, he made millions playing online poker. It's kind of a crazy separate story that doesn't have anything to do with anything except a little bit about Mike's background. So if you are interested in that, I will link to how you can check out what the rest of it is. But I think the big mental health takeaway from this whole episode is to have someone that you can talk to. And I think that's more key than anything. If you don't have that person, you need to find someone that you can at least confide in or begin a conversation with or talk to. It helps so much when you're in a bad place. And I think, the story that I tell in that, I didn't tell anyone. I didn't have anyone that I could sort of talk to at that time. I was too busy. There was too much going on. I just didn't feel like I could tell anyone about what I was feeling. And so you bottle it up and then explode at one point in however you do. And so I think that is all bad. And I think if I had been more open and been talking to people and been okay with being vulnerable and saying, hey, I don't like this and I'm not in a great place, then you can. And then you can actually begin to figure out, okay, well, what can I do to make it better? So that is the big takeaway, and I will continue and do more of these types of episodes talking about kind of the mental health and the workplace idea of feeling better, because I think that the more of this you do, the happier you can be at work and what you're doing. And I think that is like absolutely critical, especially in these COVID times where we may feel alone in our offices working away and not able to sort of share our feelings. So if there is someone, or if you have a problem, or if you know me, or even if you don't know me, you can always send me a message and I'm happy to share my experiences or talk as well. And yeah, that's kind of all I got to say for today. So thanks so much for listening. I've got a really cool bunch of episodes coming up. One was with an Olympian. I just recorded that recently, so that is coming up very soon, and I've got a bunch of other really good ones. I'm just getting going here. I'm figuring out how to do podcasting, so I really appreciate you listening all the way to the end here and being a fan. So thank you so much for listening, and until next time, don't worry, be happy.